Good morning, everybody. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the jump exercise we're going to get into next week, and just give you a little bit of foundation in terms of what we're going to actually be doing for the assignment, and just some guidelines for what I'd like to see with your reference material for the jump. So the jump really is kind of a combination of the two exercises we've done so far in class, including a little bit of that in-class exercise we just did. So looking back to the ball, so we've got our bouncing ball, which is dealing with obviously path of action. So we're dealing with nice kind of arcing motion. We're dealing with a little bit of squash and stretch. We also talked about timing, ease in, ease out. Those are the three main aspects for that particular assignment. What's this? So just another example of the ball. So we have, again, just the ball going straight up and down in this case. So it's a linear path, but we're still getting that sense of timing, gravity taking hold. So it's definitely easing in and easing out at the top of its position. If we were to look at the translate Y graph for that, it would still be that nice kind of bubbly arc. So just reiterating one more time, so we have our starting pose for the animation we just saw here. All right, we have our beginning, then we have our typical bouncing ball aspect to it, and then there's a couple terms that we haven't actually discussed yet, which we're going to be looking at with this particular exercise, where we have this guy here. So typically when we're getting into characters, there's going to be a little bit of a kind of a recoil or a counter motion before the actual action, which is referred to as anticipation. So in this case, it's a very simple object. The anticipation in this case is like a squash. So essentially the ball's kind of going to propel itself upwards, almost as if it's its own character. Which is different from our exercise where we were just having basically an inanimate object kind of bouncing through frame. But here we have our squash and stretch. This is our recovery. We're going through our nice arcing path of action where we have an ease in, ease out near the top, just because we're getting a condensing of frames in that area, so it'll create a slow down effect. Our object will speed up again. We're getting into some stretch, going into that arc and out of that arc. We have our squash again on the impact. And then to resolve this motion, this is usually referred to as the recovery. So in this case, we have just a slight overshooting of the shape, and then it kind of settles back down into its original default position, which is more spherical. So let's do an example giving this legs. So this is a long winter character called the Stomposaurus. So in this case, we've got the body, which is kind of like the ball. We've got a couple legs that are going to be propelling this through. But in essence, we're dealing with a very similar kind of series of events. We have our anticipation. We have the arc, which eases in and eases out through the top. We have the landing, and then the recovery. So again, we have the anticipation is the downward motion, the arc, and then the recovery is kind of that squash position at the end, and then kind of doing a little bit of an overshoot, and then settling back into a default position. And again, we've also talked about the pendulum. So here's kind of a little bit more of a kind of a fluid version of that with a whip, but we're dealing with the line of action with the pendulum. So essentially we have the curve that goes through the pose, and typically when we're going through kind of quick transitions from one direction to another direction, this shape typically changes into what's called the S-curve. And we also have drag, which is a bit of a C shape. So if I were to kind of frame through this, Again, we get into these kind of S shapes through the transitions from one direction to the next. And then as we go through the main kind of speed poses of the faster transitions, where the end kind of lags behind the what's causing the momentum, or what's causing the object to move, we get into this kind of C shape because the end is dragging behind the primary motion. Now with the jump, we're kind of combining the two. So we have our ball, and then we have, say, this kind of represents our character's spine, and maybe head is kind of like the orange cylinder here that's on the top. So if we were to look at this, again, we have our anticipation, which is this downward motion. If I can, I think I've got some stills next. I should bring up my speaking notes. So we have this anticipation, which is this downward motion. Now, there's going to be a little bit of a delay as we go further and further from that object. So as we start going up, this is kind of S-curving down and then dragging behind, so it delays through the primary action. As we go through the top of the arc, things kind of form back to, you know, more of a neutral position. And then as it comes out of that, we're getting into our stretch. And then we have our recovery, where we have the impact. This delays, so it kind of goes through an S-curve as it transitions from more of a linear path down into kind of an overshoot forward. So we're to watch that again. So really it's just a combination of the two things that we've looked at. So there's the bouncing ball aspect, and then there's the pendulum, and its force is being driven by the ball. Now, in actuality, that ball represents the character's mass, center of gravity. All right. So for our assignment, though, we're not really going to be dealing with a character jumping just straight up and down. We're actually going to be jumping across or over an object. So let's check this out. So again, all the same principles are there from just jumping straight up and down. So we have an anticipation, we have our arc where we're going to be easing in, easing out through the top slightly. We have our landing, so we have our stretch and squash going into the impact. And then we also have this overshoot and this pendulum aspect through the spine and head. So you get this nice kind of S-curve transition on the landing and whatnot. Now, in actual fact, when we get into reality, it's going to be there, but it's going to be much more subdued. So let's look at a really kind of exaggerated form of this. This is something I did a number of years back. This was our original pre-rigged character, which, you know, it worked. It has some issues, but Tony. So let's just watch this. So this is really no different from what we just saw with the sphere and the spine head thing. The only difference is that, similar to the Stomposaurus earlier on, we've got some legs. The legs are doing the propelling. So they're kind of springing up for the squash position in the beginning. And, you know, we're getting a nice kind of stretch position as the body stretches out into the jump. We'll look at a breakdown in a second. The only thing that's really different is that now we have arms. And in actual fact, the arms are just additional pendulums that are being controlled, right? They have muscles, there's bones. But their transition, their swings, you know, it's just like the pendulum. You have the overlap, you have the S curves, you have the C curves. And in that sense, it's no different. And then obviously there's the hands and fingers too at the end. So you get this nice kind of fluid transition. And in this case, we also have a secondary action of the hat. So it just gives us a little bit more of a, in this case, it just adds a little bit of a nice kind of floaty touch to that, just embellishing all of the action that we're seeing. So let's take a look at a breakdown from this. So again, we have our main anticipation, which is our squash down here. Now, you notice in this case, the character actually kind of arcs up slightly. So he does do this kind of arcing up pose. So that's almost like a small anticipation before he goes into the major anticipation of the squash position. That's not necessary, not necessarily needed, but it is a nice touch. So whenever you have a main motion, it is good to have a counter motion, and that counter motion again is the anticipation. And it kind of goes into what I was saying the other day, where all animation is really based off of contrasts. Squash, stretch, acting choices, emotional changes, a variety of things. And I need another coffee before I get through everything. And again, we'll go through this in more detail as we break down this in class on Wednesday. But here we can see we have a small anticipation up. We have a big anticipation down as the character kind of coils up, builds all his energy so that he can push himself off into our stretch position. And then we have this kind of easing in and easing out as the character doesn't get as squashed as the squash position, but everything kind of collects at the top of the arc. In actuality, the feet are going to start swinging forward, getting ready for the landing. Then we are going through a stretch position on the way down. The spine is going through a nice kind of S-curve into that kind of more stretch or squash, position on the landing. And then we get this kind of overshoot where everything kind of overshoots and then falls into place to the final position. So this overshooting and everything is really part of the recovery. All right, so a couple new terms, anticipation and recovery. Now, something that we're going to start looking at too is this idea of the line of action. And it does go back to our pendulum. But going beyond what I was looking at earlier with the ball and then just the spinal cord, which was a kind of a simplified version of the line of action. Now we're going to start thinking about the line of action through all of our poses. Just how do we get nice fluid kind of transitions between our poses as we're blocking in our animation and so on. And this is something we'll look at on Wednesday. All right. Now, this is kind of getting into the reference I want you guys to start looking at, or to create, I should say, for next week. So you're going to be standing beside an object, and something that's not too high. I don't want you hurting yourself jumping over something. I used a backpack, and I'll show you my reference from the fall. And I was able to rope my kids into helping me shoot some additional reference as well. This was don't mind the messiness of the house. So let's watch this. So this is slow-mo, just so we can see kind of a breakdown of the action here. So we have our anticipation, stretch, top of the arc as we recollect. Now this is very similar to what in a very dramatic 3-point landing. Okay, yeah, you had to throw that in there. And recovery. All right. Now this is very typical of a primate or human jump, where we're going to have a little bit less drag through the spine. So the full body example I showed earlier was a really kind of pushed, cartoony version of the jump. And as we get into more believable motion, typically the spine is going to stay just a little bit more angled. We're going to want to push that a little bit, otherwise it's going to be a little bit too stiff and unnatural for 3D, especially with our characters, because they are going to be a little bit more stylized, a little bit more cartoony. So we do want to push things and exaggerate, which is another principle, our actions just a little bit. beyond the footage, but this is going to give us a good sense of timing. But typically, though, with the primates, we do get this kind of arcing, just so that if anything goes wrong, the arms are going to be easily there to catch us, and also it allows us to really focus in on where we're going to be landing. So if we were to watch that one more time. Cool. So let's watch another example. So this is my oldest son. So my youngest son, he did a good job, but there is some insecurity with what he was doing. Here, let's just go back. There's some little micro self-corrections, and depending on the age of your character, it's good to get try to capture these. Yeah, you can even see that right in through here, right? As he's coming down, watch this arm, right? It's kind of self-correcting a little bit. It kind of readjusting just so that he can hit that landing. And it's not necessarily something you'd actually probably even see or notice so much in real time, but because our brain processes information so quickly, in slow motion, you can really kind of see that. Now, when you get into somebody who's more skilled or older, it's going to be a bit more assured type of motion. They kind of know what they're doing just through muscle memory, and maybe especially if you get into, say, an Olympic gymnast, through muscle memory and doing things thousands and thousands of times, there's going to be a lot less of that. It's going to be very, very kind of focused motion. All right, so let's watch this. This is my older son here volunteering. And then jumping over. So it's the same object, just a green bin on its side. If the green bin is on height-wise, that's probably going to be too tall, to be honest, for you guys to jump over. For me, it is, for sure. All right, let's watch this one more time, and then we'll just do a quick breakdown. Cool. Now, this is going to be all very similar to what we've talked about so far. So we have a default starting position. We have our anticipation down, which is like the squash. We have a stretch into the arc of the jump, where we're having a little bit of ease in, ease out through the top of that. Stretch into the landing, and then we're getting into our impact, which is our squash, and then obviously we have our recovery after that. Now, one thing I want to point out is here, like if we look at the feet, asymmetry in motion. That's one thing that we're going to want to start adding into our animation. Something we're going to look at, and I'll reiterate this as we start posing out our characters in class on Wednesday, is to make sure that both sides of the character, the left and right side of your body, aren't doing the exact same thing all the time. The odd time, if you have a conductor conducting an orchestra, he might be using both hands, swinging very similarly, even though slight variations in posing and whatnot is ideal. But that's called twinning. It's also called mirroring. And it is something that it does stand out when watching. Asymmetrical motion tends to be more fluid. It'll feel more natural because typically in life we aren't robots, right? So we're not doing things exactly the same on both sides of the body. So having that asymmetry is good. So even up here through the top, right? There's an asymmetrical aspect to the feet. The arms, right? When you're thinking about this, there's like kind of a looseness to this, where one arm is swinging behind the body, one's in front. So there's a randomness to how things are in real life that we want to capture. All right, so, and this just kind of reiterates everything I just mentioned, right? So we have our anticipation, stretch, the head's looking towards the landing, stretch out of the top of the arc into our squash pose on the landing. And then we have an asymmetrical placement of the feet. So one foot hits the ground first, and then the other one kind of follows and hits second. When we get into posing, we're going to also want to look at, rotation of the hips, rotation of the chest, shoulders, those small things that we were starting to talk about a little bit with the ball pickup exercise the other day. All right, so I did it height-wise, and this is from the fall. I think it's right after Thanksgiving, so I probably needed to do a bunch of jumps probably at that point. So we have slow motion, out of shape, adult. Okay, so here we go. Now, for this, you could have a little, the odd little micro step leading into this. You could have some very minor acting if you want, but the focus for this will be the jump. So when you're shooting your reference, remember the jump is the focus. If you are going to be doing little tiny steps getting into that, make sure you watch the video I posted last week on baby steps, because it outlines things that you definitely want to think about when doing those types of motions, or those, in this case, the little tiny steps. Otherwise, things could look fairly stiff. All right, so let's watch this. So we have our anticipation down. I do a little step into it. We have our stretch into and out of the arc and recovery. Let's see, this is real time, so not very nimble. I have a couple little things I wanted to bring in because my ogre is going to be jumping over a rock, a wishing rock. It has some wishing rock. It's a tongue twister. Has some words on the side he's reading and whatnot, which is right here. And it's difficult to see. I might go back into Substance Painter and just increase that a little bit. But you're going to have a character. You could create your own prop that he's going to be jumping over, or it could be as simple as a cube. It's going to be up to you. I don't want to stifle your imagination. But he is going to be, or she, the character, it, whichever long winter studio rig you're going to end up using, is going to jump over the object. So just one more time in terms of the requirements for your video footage. Character needs to jump over or across an object. Now, for your reference, have a physical object to jump over, because the mechanics are going to be a little bit different as opposed to just jumping over something that doesn't exist. You need to demonstrate the following animation principles, and this is something we'll look at next week, right, when we actually get into animating it. I don't really want you to start animating between now and next week. Just bring your reference to class, because I do want to get going right off the top into the character stuff. So there really won't be time to shoot reference, so make sure that it's just all ready to go in the right format, so we can bring it into Maya as onto an image plane. But these are the principles we'll be looking at. So anticipation, squash and stretch, timing, ease in, ease out, path of action, lines of action, center of gravity. Something I didn't really talk too much about just right at the moment, but it will become evident based off of your video footage that you're going to record. It is something I talked a little bit about when dealing with the pickup, the ball pickup. So that's going to become more and more important as we get our character moving around through space. Secondary action. We'll look at secondary animation, or sorry, secondary motion as well. They're a little bit different. Overlap, follow through, staging, posing, and silhouettes. So basically almost everything. As soon as we get into the character, all of the principles are going to really kind of come into play. So it's going to be a bit different from the ball. And then I also just remember the baby steps. So, you know, this is just random baby steps, but the principles are there for what you need to know to do what you do this type of thing. If your character is going to just be doing minor movements through space. What I might do too is between now and next week, I do have a video on doing walk cycles, and then using those walk cycles to push your character through space. What I'll do is I'll give you guys access to that as well. But, you know, the focus isn't walking. The focus for this is jumping. So we want to really keep all of the extraneous extra stuff to a minimum if you could. Otherwise, it just becomes a lot of extra work for yourself, and you don't want to burn yourself out because you will have a lot of other assignments going on at the same time. All right, so I think that's it for this. I'm going to post it, and if you have any questions, feel free to Slack me. All right.